A particular kind of contradiction that only makes sense if you stop listening to what a leader says and start watching what they actually sign. Most people never make that shift. They follow the words, the press conferences, the declarations delivered with a clenched jaw and a pointed finger. They hear the threats, they see the posture, and they assume reasonably that what comes next will match what was promised. But sometimes what comes next is the exact opposite. And when that happens, the gap between the performance and the outcome is not just politically embarrassing. It is strategically consequential in ways that take years to fully measure. That is the story unfolding right now between Washington and Tehran. And it deserves to be looked at clearly without the noise of celebration on one side or hysteria on the other. Donald Trump, in the days and weeks leading up to this moment, was not speaking softly. He was doing the opposite of speaking softly. The language coming from the White House and from Trump himself was about eradication. It was about elimination. It was about reducing Iran's influence, dismantling its capacity, ending its threat, not managing it, not containing it, not negotiating around it, ending it. The word obliterate was used. The phrase maximum pressure was revived. The message sent through public statements, through back channels, through the deliberate amplification of military positioning across the Gulf was unmistakable. America under Trump was not interested in another deal. It was interested in a result. And then Iran submitted a 10-point plan, and Washington approved it. Let that sit for a moment, because if you read that sentence too quickly, you miss what it actually contains. The administration that had been threatening to eradicate Iran's influence, that had positioned itself as the hardest line possible against the Islamic Republic, looked at a 10-point document produced by the Iranian government and said yes. The details of those 10 points, what they require, what they leave untouched, what they promise versus what they actually deliver, those details are what the story is really about. Because the headlines are not telling you what is in them. They are telling you that a deal was reached. They are telling you that tensions have been reduced. They are telling you that diplomacy once again pulled the world back from the edge. What they are not telling you is what that edge was actually made of, and whether the deal has moved anyone away from it or simply agreed to stop looking down. Before we go further, if you want analysis that goes past the press release and into what is actually happening, stay with this, because this story will define a significant piece of the next several years, and the foundation is being laid right now, largely out of view. To understand what this 10-point agreement actually means, you first have to understand the position Iran was in before it was offered. And this is the context that is being almost entirely left out of the mainstream coverage. Iran was not negotiating from a position of comfort. This is not an opinion. It is a measurable fact across multiple dimensions. Economically, the Islamic Republic was under a degree of strain that its government had not been able to fully absorb or conceal. The rial had been losing value at rates that ordinary Iranians felt every single day at the market, at the fuel station, in the cost of medicines and basic goods. The middle class in Iran, which had spent years hoping that engagement with the West would eventually translate into economic normality, had largely abandoned that hope. What replaced it was not revolution, not yet, but a deep and spreading cynicism about the regime's ability to deliver anything resembling a stable future. The oil sector, which is the financial spine of the Iranian state, was operating well below its potential. Sanctions had not shut off Iranian oil exports entirely. They never do. But they had forced Tehran into deeply discounted arrangements, selling to buyers who knew they had leverage and used it, and routing exports through mechanisms that were expensive, unreliable, and subject to disruption. The revenue the regime needed to maintain its military apparatus, its proxy network, and its domestic patronage systems was being generated under conditions that required constant improvisation. Simultaneously, the regional architecture that Iran has spent decades building as its primary instrument of strategic power was under significant stress. The network of armed groups across Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria that Tehran funds, arms, and directs had absorbed more pressure in the preceding years than at almost any previous point in its history. Some of this was the result of Israeli military operations, some was the result of American pressure, some was the result of internal fractures within the groups themselves, the inevitable consequence of sustaining armed movements through extended periods of conflict without delivering the victories that justify the sacrifice. The axis of resistance, as Tehran calls it, was still standing, but it was standing with less confidence and less capacity than it had before. This is the starting point that matters, because when you sit down to read a 10-point plan that Iran submitted for American approval, the first question is not what is in it. The first question is who needed this more? And the honest answer to that question is Tehran, which makes what Washington approved all the more important to examine carefully. The 10 points, as described through official and unofficial channels, cover a range of commitments that sound, on the surface, like exactly what a maximum pressure strategy should produce. There are pledges around nuclear transparency. There are assurances about regional behavior. There is language about proxy activities. There are references to economic normalization being conditional on verified compliance. Taken at face value, it reads like a checklist of American demands. And that is precisely the problem, because the history of negotiations with Iran across multiple administrations and multiple agreements teaches one consistent lesson. The gap between what Iran commits to on paper and what Iran does in practice is not a gap you can close with better language. It is a gap you can only close with enforcement mechanisms that have real consequences, real timelines, and real teeth. And the 10-point plan, as structured, does not appear to contain those mechanisms in any meaningful form. What it contains is language, well-crafted, diplomatically satisfying, politically useful language that gives both sides something to say to their respective audiences without actually resolving the tensions that made this confrontation necessary in the first place. Iran's nuclear program is not dismantled under this plan. It is addressed. There is a difference between those two words that the entire future of the agreement lives inside. The uranium enrichment infrastructure that Tehran has built over 2 decades, the centrifuge arrays, the hardened facilities, the technical expertise that cannot be unlearned, that infrastructure remains. The commitments around it are monitoring commitments, transparency commitments, not rollback commitments. Iran has not agreed to reduce its enrichment capacity. It has agreed to let people watch it more closely. These are not the same thing. And treating them as the same thing, which is what the celebratory coverage is doing, is exactly the kind of category confusion that produces strategic disasters on a delayed timeline. The proxy architecture is equally unresolved. The 10-point plan includes language about Iran not escalating through third parties. What it does not include is a verifiable, enforceable mechanism for dismantling the relationships, the weapons pipelines, the financial flows, the command and control structures that make those third parties dangerous in the first place. Hezbollah still exists. The Houthi movement still controls significant territory and retains significant military capability. The Iraqi militia networks that operate under Iranian guidance are still armed, still organized, and still politically embedded in ways that give Tehran leverage over a government that America spent enormous blood and treasure trying to stabilize. None of that changed. What changed is that Tehran has promised in writing to encourage de-escalation, a promise from a government that has made and broken such promises more times than a serious analyst can count with patience. Now consider how the region is reading this moment, because the perception dimension of this agreement is as consequential as its substance, possibly more so. American credibility in the Middle East is not maintained through speeches. It is not maintained through carrier groups or military exercises or strongly worded statements from the Pentagon. It is maintained through a single, simple, consistently demonstrated principle. When America draws a line, crossing it has costs. When America applies pressure, that pressure produces results. When America threatens, the threat is backed by a willingness to follow through. The moment any of those elements becomes uncertain, the entire architecture of American deterrence in the region begins to wobble, not collapse, not immediately, wobble, which is how strategic erosion works. Quietly, at the edges, in the small calculations made in capitals that do not make the front pages, but that cumulatively determine whether American power is respected or merely managed. The Gulf states are watching this agreement with the particular attention of governments that have built their security architecture around a single assumption, that American pressure on Iran would eventually compel a genuine transformation. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, states that have quietly cooperated with American maximum pressure campaigns, states that have absorbed Iranian-backed threats to their infrastructure and their stability, are now watching Washington approve a 10-point plan that Iran submitted. They are not asking whether the language is satisfying. They are asking whether the result is durable. And the answer they are arriving at through their own analytical processes and their own intelligence services is not encouraging. Israel's position is simpler and more urgent. From Jerusalem's perspective, an Iran that retains its nuclear infrastructure, retains its proxy relationships, and has now secured American approval for a document that legitimizes its continued role as a regional power, is an Iran that has won something significant without surrendering anything equivalent. The Israeli government has said in various forms and forums that no piece of paper changes the strategic reality of a nuclear threshold Iran with an intact capacity to threaten Israeli territory through proxies across multiple borders. That assessment has not changed because Washington approved 10 points. If anything, it has become more urgent. The governments in Baghdad and Beirut are reading this differently, but the conclusion they arrive at is similarly unflattering to American resolve. In both countries, Iranian-aligned political forces have spent years arguing that alignment with Tehran is the winning bet, that America makes noise but eventually accommodates, that the Islamic Republic absorbs pressure and survives, and that betting against it is a losing proposition. The 10-point approval gives those forces something concrete to point to. It is not just an argument anymore. It is evidence. Here is the question that deserves more attention than it is receiving. Was this approval a strategic choice or a political one? Was it the result of a deliberate calculation that the 10 points, whatever their limitations, represent the best achievable outcome given the current balance of forces? Or was it the result of something simpler and more concerning, the need for a win, the domestic political pressure to produce a headline that says deal reached, the exhaustion of managing a confrontation that had no clean resolution in sight? The answer to that question is not publicly available in any definitive form, but there are indicators, and the indicators are worth examining. The speed of the approval is one of them. Maximum pressure strategies, if they are functioning as intended, should produce leverage that takes time to convert into durable concessions. The pressure builds. The target makes preliminary overtures. There is a period of genuine back and forth in which the party under pressure is forced to offer more than it initially wants to. Eventually, if the pressure is sustained and the demands are clear, an agreement is reached that reflects the actual power differential. That process takes time because the process itself is the mechanism through which real concessions are extracted. A rapid approval of a document submitted by the pressured party without extended negotiation over its terms is not consistent with that process. It is consistent with a different process, one in which the goal was agreement rather than transformation. The Chinese dimension adds a layer of clarity to what is otherwise a murky picture. Beijing's response to the 10-point approval was warm, immediate, and notably specific in its praise. Chinese state media described the outcome as a demonstration of multilateral diplomacy working as intended, which is diplomatic language for saying the result served interests beyond those of the two parties at the table. China has deep and specific reasons to prefer an Iran that is intact, economically recovering, and diplomatically legitimized over an Iran that has been forced into genuine structural concessions by sustained American pressure. The 25-year strategic cooperation agreement that China signed with Iran in 2021 is not a peripheral relationship. It is a foundational one. It connects Chinese investment to Iranian infrastructure, Chinese energy security to Iranian oil exports, Chinese regional strategy to Iranian resistance to American primacy. An Iran that has absorbed maximum pressure and survived, that has submitted a 10-point plan and had it approved, that can now present itself to its own population and to the region as an Islamic republic that stared down the most powerful nation on earth and came out with a signed agreement that Iran is enormously useful to Beijing, not because Beijing directed this outcome, but because Beijing understood what it would produce before Washington had fully processed what it was agreeing to. And this is the pattern that deserves the widest frame. Every year that Washington is managing an unresolved Iran problem, negotiating, renegotiating, applying pressure, offering relief, applying pressure again, is a year that is not being invested in the primary strategic challenge of this era. The competition with China across technology, naval power, economic influence across the developing world, and the construction of an alternative to the American-led international order. That competition does not pause while Washington is occupied with Tehran. Beijing understands this. Tehran understands this. The question is whether Washington's decision-making has fully absorbed it. A 10-point plan that re-engages the United States in the diplomatic management of a problem it has not solved, one that will require monitoring, interpretation, enforcement, debates, and constant attention, is not a neutral outcome from the perspective of where American strategic energy should be focused. It is a diversion. And in great power competition, diversions are never free. Let us now be specific about what America gave up in approving this plan, because the concessions are real, even if they are wrapped in language designed to make them sound like conditions. The sanctions relief that is embedded in the economic normalization language of the 10-point framework gives Iran's government financial oxygen it had been running short of. The precise figures matter less than the structural reality. Economic pressure that was genuinely biting, pressure that was producing internal vulnerability for the regime, has now been partially lifted. The money that flows back into Iranian government systems under the terms of this agreement does not get deposited into a fund for democratic reform or nuclear dismantlement. It gets distributed through the same channels that have always sustained the Islamic Republic's military posture, its proxy relationships, and its ability to manage the domestic discontent that the sanctions were helping to generate. Tehran has also received something arguably more valuable than money. It has received legitimacy. The approval of a 10-point plan that Iran submitted converts the Islamic Republic from a maximum pressured outlier into a diplomatic participant whose proposals are taken seriously by the world's most powerful government. That conversion has a value that is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. It changes how Iran's neighbors calculate their own relationships with Tehran. It changes how international businesses assess the risk of engagement with Iranian markets. It changes the internal political dynamic in Iran in ways that strengthen the hand of hardliners who have always argued that resistance, not accommodation, is the path to survival. What Tehran has learned from this moment is precise and dangerous. It has learned that the threshold for American accommodation is reachable, that a period of absorbed pressure combined with a well-structured document submitted at the right moment produces approval rather than escalation, that the gap between what America threatens and what America ultimately accepts is wider than the threats suggest. This is an extraordinarily important lesson to have taught, because the next confrontation will not begin from the same starting point. It will begin from a point where Iranian strategists already know where the American limit sits. The domestic political dimension of this approval is equally consequential and equally under-examined. An administration that has built its Iran posture on the language of maximum pressure and eradication, that has used the most aggressive rhetorical framing available to signal its seriousness, faces a specific and painful trap once it approves a deal. The narrative of toughness that justified the pressure campaign now requires the deal to be presented as a victory extracted through that toughness. The 10 points, whatever their limitations, must be defended as sufficient. Critics who note that the nuclear infrastructure is intact and the proxy network is unresolved must be characterized as people who prefer war to diplomacy. The public, which is not unreasonably tired of open-ended Middle Eastern confrontation, is broadly receptive to a story that says the crisis is over. The political incentive to defend the deal becomes self-reinforcing almost immediately. The trap is this: if Iran, in the months following this approval, advances its nuclear enrichment incrementally, or begins quietly rearming its proxy relationships, or tests the interpretation of the 10 points in ways that fall below the threshold of obvious violation, the administration faces a choice with no clean options. It can acknowledge the deterioration and re-escalate, which means admitting that what it called a victory was not. Or it can absorb the deterioration quietly, adjusting its public assessments, lowering the bar for what counts as compliance, rather than paying the political cost of reversal. History across administrations of both parties suggests the second path is more commonly chosen. And Iranian strategists are not unaware of this dynamic. It is not incidental to their approach. It is central to it. There are 3 trajectories along which this 10-point agreement will move, and clarity about all 3 is more useful than confidence in any one. The first is the genuinely optimistic one, and it deserves honest acknowledgement. It is possible that the 10-point framework, despite its structural limitations, creates enough space for Iranian pragmatists to push the relationship in a new direction. It is possible that the economic relief embedded in the agreement strengthens the political position of those within the Iranian system who believe that a sustainable relationship with the outside world is preferable to permanent confrontation. It is possible that the nuclear commitments, inadequate as they appear today, become the foundation for a more comprehensive arrangement that actually addresses the enrichment question. If this trajectory unfolds, the critics of this approval will have been wrong. The architects will have been right. That outcome is not impossible, and anyone who tells you otherwise with certainty is overstating their own foresight. The second trajectory is more consistent with the historical pattern of Iranian behavior across the past 4 decades. In this scenario, the 10 points hold on the surface while the substance underneath quietly deteriorates. Nuclear enrichment advances in increments calibrated to remain beneath the threshold of obvious provocation. Proxy networks begin the patient work of rearming and rebuilding under conditions of reduced scrutiny. Economic relief provides the internal stabilization the regime needed to manage its domestic pressures. In 18 to 24 months, the United States finds itself facing an Iran problem that looks structurally identical to the one it faced before this agreement, but with Tehran in a stronger position, with American deterrence in the region somewhat diminished, and with the domestic political space for a harder response constrained by the prior declaration of success. The third trajectory is the most dangerous. It involves a collapse of the framework not through a single dramatic violation, but through an accumulation of interpretive disputes, incremental tests, and proxy actions that erode the agreement from the inside. A discovered nuclear advance, a significant proxy attack, a political shift inside Iran that empowers hardliners who never accepted the 10-point framework as legitimate. Any of these could trigger a new escalation cycle. But this time, America enters that cycle having already played the maximum pressure card and accepted a lesser outcome. The credibility cost of re-escalating after approval is higher than the credibility cost of maintaining pressure before it. Partners who watched one full cycle of pressure, then accommodation, will be slower to commit. Adversaries who watched the same cycle will be more confident about how the next one ends. The strategic verdict on this approval is not a simple one, and pretending otherwise would be intellectually dishonest. It is not obviously wrong to have stopped a military confrontation from escalating. The costs of a wider conflict in the Gulf are real, and the people who would pay them first are not the ones making the decisions in Washington or Tehran. It is not obviously wrong to give diplomacy a chance to address what military pressure could not definitively resolve. These are legitimate considerations, and they deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. But the terms on which this particular diplomatic outcome was reached, the intact nuclear infrastructure, the surviving proxy architecture, the economic relief without structural transformation, the approval of Iran's own submitted document rather than a negotiated framework built around American demands, those terms suggest that the priority was managing the immediate confrontation rather than resolving its underlying causes. And underlying causes in international relations do not disappear because they have been temporarily quieted. They accumulate, they compound, they return at the moment of their choosing, which is rarely the moment that is most convenient for the side that chose to look away. The measure of any agreement between adversaries is never whether it produces quiet in the short term. Quiet is easy. Quiet can be purchased with almost any concession. The measure is whether the conditions that produce the confrontation have been changed in ways that make the next one less likely. By that measure, this 10-point approval leaves serious questions open, and the answers will arrive over the next several years, whether Washington is ready for them or not. Trump threatened to eradicate Iran's influence. Tehran submitted 10 points. Washington said yes.